Hello, everyone. We are back with Black Ass Our History Presents. Y'all late to the revolution. This is the third chapter of y'all relate to the revolution. And in this segment, we'll be talking about the rage that is Harlem. So I'm just going to pause here for those that would like to read the disclaimer. If you've been here before, go ahead and just give us a moment. All right, so again, we are looking at how we begin to dive into beautiful Harlem. I do want to advise that this will provide a deeper understanding of how Harlem came to be. I'm really big on framework and context before we start looking at the production of creativity and arts that come out of it. So, we're going to look at how the evolution of a Dutch outpost of farmland becomes a mecca for the African American community in the early 1900s. So originally, Harlem was the home of what the Americans would know as the Manhattan Indigenous Tribe. By 1637 to 1639, the area was settled by Dutch. Harlem was most likely farmland, and by 1660, Harlem would become incorporated as a city. By the early middle 1700s, Harlem had become sort of a resort for the wealthy to get away from Manhattan. So during the American Revolution, specifically the Battle of Harlem, Harlem was burnt to the ground by the British. Manhattan was built fairly quickly while it took an extensive time for Harlem. It would not be until the grid system, which would extend from Manhattan or proper New York, that development would begin to pick up a little bit. Otherwise, the progress was slow. So by the 19th century, although still areas of the farmland, Harlem was anything but poor with these farmland-like estates. With the development of railroads, Harlem would now be connected to the newly incorporated, connected to Manhattan through the newly incorporated New York and Harlem Railroad in 1831, Metro North. By 1851, Charles Henry Hall, a developer, saw the potential and began the infrastructure of building out streets, including sewer lines, gas lines, and things needed for a functioning urban space. Then, once the piers were beginning to be added in Harlem, we'll now see the community north of Manhattan becoming more industrious, factories are opening, and politicians and a few businessmen are beginning to settle as permanent residents. Again, it was fairly slow in development, and this is where we also begin to see African Americans begin to move into Harlem, although very small, due to opportunities of employment and cheap rent. Now, post Civil War, Harlem was still doing well economically. This time, the community was growing and the population shifted to being more Italian and Jewish. Row houses would soon appear throughout the beautiful neighborhood. However, it could not house the ever growing and increasing population. Soon, the rising of tenement apartments began to spring up everywhere. So this is around Harlem 1900s, and as that population continued to rise, so did these tenement buildings. However, the conditions of these tenements were not appealing, and in some places, this overall atrocious, not just in Harlem, but in New York in general. Fearful of a new act that was in discussion, owners and developers of these properties attempted to build quickly prior to 1901. In 1901, you have the New York Tenement Act of 1901, which went into law. Ultimately, the act banned constructions to dark, fully ventilated buildings. Additionally, there were other requirements, including outward facing windows. This was also the era of progressive movement, and one of the beliefs is that cleaner cities made for better citizens. So, how did Harlem go from being a neighborhood of wealthy businessmen and farm owners to Jewish and Italian population to ultimately becoming a black mecca? So, there's a couple things that are coming to play. Completed in 1903, you have the construction of the Williamsburg Bridge. Unfortunately, this bridge would displace around 17,000 residents, as well as destroy those tenement buildings that once stood. And additionally, as these tenement buildings are being destroyed, they're connecting communities. The immigration population for Europe has also continued to grow in the city of New York. However, it would be the 1904 New York rent strike that would really impact. So on May 1st of each year, landlords would announce there would be an increase in rent. This will also be known as moving day. So if tenants couldn't afford the rent, that was the day they would move. On May 1st, 1904, these landlords proposed an exorbitant increase. They were talking anywhere up to 30%. However, it would be Jewish immigrant women on the Lower East Side who would organize a strike, learning to strike from other price increases around kosher items. This strike would really have an impact just for a short period of time. The strike would include about 800 tenements and about 2,000 families. However, the landlords would increase the rent again, resulting in the 1907 rent strike. So again, short term, but overall, it really didn't do much. So with the rent strike occurring in Lower East Side, there would be a mass immigration to Harlem around 1904 strike. And again, that's rent increasing everywhere within the territories near New York City. The reason that Black people were able to rent and reside in Harlem is thanks to this man. Meet Philip Payton Jr. He is known as the father of Harlem. He grew up in Massachusetts, and his family business was a barber. He actually attended Livingston College, and instead of continuing being a barber in Massachusetts, he decided to move to New York. His family wasn't too happy about it, but there he was able to learn and acquire many skills. He had worked at a department store. He was also a barber, and then he became a porter in a real estate office. That's where he got the idea to open his own real estate company. So, partnering with his partner Brown, they opened Brown and Payton Real Estate in 1900. The business failed and was not too successful. And unfortunately, Brown would leave the business, and Payton and his wife would struggle and become evicted. However, in 1904, he chartered the Afro American Realty Company. And what was amazing about this company, he actually chartered it and sold shares. I think it was approximately 500 shares for $10. So at the time, wealthy Black business investors were able to help get the company off the ground. In 1905, Hudson Realty, it's a white owned realty firm, also began development in Harlem, purchasing three buildings from Afro American Realty. Hudson would evict all the Black tenants and move white tenants in. Afro American Realty responded by buying adjacent property near Hudson's, would evict the white families that were there, and they would move in Black families. This would go on and on. Eventually, Hudson would sell all the original three buildings back to Peyton and his company. And so that is how Peyton was able to help African Americans begin to rent in these tenements. Here's the thing though, Peyton was not completely honest with his investors, and he was sued and found guilty. So he was not completely honest with how the numbers are doing, the income that was coming in, nor the profit. However, other white landlords in Harlem could not find white tenants at this time, and Peyton would fill those buildings up with those Black tenants. So here is just an example of Harlem's African American population increase. And so, in addition to education and employment opportunities, as well as escaping Jim Crow, it would be the 1970 World War draft impacted the industries in the North. So, they needed people to come work. So, if you look at the graph, we see how 1910, 10%, 1920, Harlem's 32.43, and by 1930, Harlem is 70.18%. Again, between those 2 years, 1920 and 1930, roughly almost 119,000 white people would leave Harlem, while a estimate of 87,500 people arrived to Harlem. So some of the white building owners and landowners refused to rent to Black people still at that time. They even tried to convince banks to deny Black mortgages, but because of the loss of the money that was occurring with them not renting and these buildings remaining empty, they inevitably rented to African Americans. This is another infographic of how we see the growth of Black Harlem. So in 1911, in that red box, you see maybe like one, two, about four streets, maybe 5 blocks over, and then 1920. And then by 1930, it has taken up a good portion of what is present day Harlem. So let's talk about what was also happening as the Black community expanded. So we have churches. Both these churches have a long history for African American parishioners prior to the Great Migration to Harlem. So some of these churches were established, but the buildings weren't yet in Harlem. So on the left, we have St. Philip's Church and was founded by free African Americans in 1809, and they previously worshiped a Trinity Church located on Wall Street. The first Reverend was Reverend Peter Williams Jr. He was also one of the founders of the American Anti Slavery Society. The construction that we see on West 134th Street began in 1910. The Abyssinian Church was founded by free blacks and Ethiopians as part of a protest of a segregated seating at the church location at First Baptist Church. The congregation would move around the city and eventually reside in this building. One of the most famous pastors of this church was Adam Clayton Powell Sr., and he would actually hand over the pastoral work and title over to his son, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. With the midst of many more churches beginning to emerge, we also have different community organizations being established. So we have the NAACP Harlem chapter in 1911. We also have Pan African and Black nationalist Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. So, with all these organizations as well as churches, Black people now have community as well as resources to begin to establish community as well as businesses and a new life for themselves. Strivers Row is one of the more well known, affluent, and maybe middle class Black areas of Harlem. Formerly also known as the St. Nicholas District, it would become home to some of Harlem's most notable musicians, politicians, educators, and artists. It got the name Strivers Row from the Black community as to highlight the ambitious middle class of Black Americans at Harlem. Located on both sides of West 138th and 139th Street between 7th Avenue, which is Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, and 8th Avenue, Frederick Douglass Boulevard. These beautiful homes were built by a white constructor, David H. King. These homes were completed in 1893. Unfortunately, King, the houses did not sell as well, and they would all be in foreclosure by 1895. Simultaneously, Harlem was slowly becoming more diverse with Black, Jewish, and Italians. However, Black folks would not be able to purchase these homes. These gorgeous homes would sit vacant for about 25 years. They would eventually sell to African Americans that could afford them. So let's talk about some of the folks that lived in this area. So we have Madam C.J. Walker moves to Harlem with her daughter Alelia in 1914. She had this beautiful townhouse construction with the ground floor being a functioning salon. The same building was also famously known as the Dark Tower when Alelia took over. The home would be a salon open to writers, poets, and intellectuals and creators as a safe space for people to think and speak freely, share resources. This would be a place that you would want to be connected with the Black middle class, but also what was going on and how best to represent themselves as African Americans. Meet Harry Pace, who's the founder of Black Swan Records. He was born into slavery and was manumitted by his owner. His owner was a relative. He would eventually attend Atlanta University or Clark Atlanta University today and establish a great rapport and relationship with his professor, W.E.B. Du Bois. Pace and Du Bois would go into business with each other in Memphis. They opened a periodical, and it didn't last long. However, that didn't stop Pace from making other connections. While in Memphis, he would meet William Christopher, or who we know as W.C. Handy, the father of the blues, and they would go into music business together, Pace and Handy. They would sell parlor music. So this is the sheet music that can be played, purchased and be played in the home. Because of the success of this business, this would lead Pace to New York, and he would open Black Swan Records in 1921, right at the top of the Harlem Renaissance. The first hit was recordings by Ethel Waters, Down Home Blues, and Old Daddy. Unfortunately, the label lasted only a couple of years. Pace had to file for bankruptcy and um, eventually sold Black Swan Records to Paramount Records. And so we're familiar with the Green Book. Let's talk about the Blue Book. So this was created by James Nelson Sims. Not only did this book provide business and Black professional address organized by city and state, but this book also would include photographs of some of the most prominent business professionals, as well as an overview of street map in each city to locate the business. And just to give an idea to show what most of Harlem's business comprised of, this is from Dr. Stephen Robertson's research and analysis of Harlem from 1950 to 30. So this shows about 250 businesses from 1923. Notice that over half of the businesses were beauty parlors or beauty parlors, barbershops, and so forth. What this does not include are the services that women may have had operating out of their home. Again, daycares, domestic work, other businesses. So it is quite possible that the number of businesses around this time could exceed more than 300. So, a quick recap. Like many cities in the United States, Harlem has had a breadth of population from indigenous tribes, Europeans escaping monarchs and dictatorships, immigrants seeking new opportunities, and Black people seeking to escape brutal racism. Cities like New York attempted to navigate the ever changing industries, overcrowding, economic booms, depression, and limited housing, which saw the ethnic population change drastically and dramatically, as well as diversely, specifically in Harlem. Although many white landlords are business and businesses resisted the increasing Black population in Harlem, they eventually allowed African Americans to participate by renting, owning property, as well as going to businesses. Now, this is not to say that there wasn't some resistance, and I believe there were many protests of considering or called like don't shop where you won't don't shop where you can't work, and that really hurt a lot of the white owned businesses in Harlem. So eventually they did have to hire African Americans in these local shops too. So from 1900 to 1930s, Harlem will become a vibrant mecca for Black people. It becomes a safe space filled with culture, expression, intellect, prosperity, and still has to deal with challenges of racism and discrimination. So thank you so much for watching this episode. Next time, we will learn how the music, the venues, and jazz will be the soundtrack of the Harlem Renaissance and inspire the beautiful visual and works of art that will emerge. Thanks, Sean. Have a great day.